Mhm, mhm, mhm. It says we're live, but I don't see a live timer, so I'm going to assume we're live until someone pops up in the comments and says otherwise. Hello, it's been about a month since we talked about Genesis. So good to be catching back up. For anyone who hasn't been catching these streams, hello, I'm Joshua Pearsall. This is Practical Christian Lessons, and in normal fashion, I entirely forgot to let everybody know, hey, there's a video going live right now. But we've been working through the book of Genesis, and particularly doing so from a Methodist perspective as myself, global Methodist, but really trying to draw out what's present in the text itself and show a lot of intertextual connections as we're working along. And tonight we're talking about the genealogies of the Bible because, well, one, we're on Genesis 5, but two, these are something that are often greatly underappreciated in the biblical, well, not just biblical studies, though, that you'll find a fair amount of work on the genealogies, but it's specifically within the field of people who are interested in genealogies, not other people. Um, and this has led to them sort of becoming a very focused field and not broadly used in the general field. A lot of people sort of read the genealogies in the Bible like we would read genealogies in our own time, and that's just not how they work. Now, lots of people will note, right, that they're different in function, but they won't always go into a level of depth and detail that really probably should be done when dealing with these genealogies. And I mean, there's for a lot of reasons, right? Genealogies are not particularly fancy, they're not particularly entertaining, but they are important. They're in the Bible for a reason. And as we'll walk through tonight, they're actually their own distinct form of literature. They're a very unique style of genre. And that may not be true for us today, but it is true for the ancient world. But we'll be getting through a few quick things as we wait for people to hop in here. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight here in a few minutes. But while we're waiting, just some quick preambling notes here. So if you haven't heard of the Anselm Guild, I just this past week did a presentation and it's up online now. This is a group. You can go here to their channel and hear a little bit more about their purpose, but they're interested in both defending and reviving Christianity in the academic world and showing the robustness to Christianity there is not just in the spiritual life, but in the academic world. And they're also wanting to help guard, prepare, and form students who are in institutions in various academies, for ranging from friendly to Christianity to hostile to Christianity, and helping build them up as disciples. So several things I'm all on board with as far as purposes there. And I did a presentation on the history of Unitarianism, slightly different haircut here. And we'll be having a part two, sort of a follow-up to that, talking about Unitarianism today, mainly talking about their theology, how to engage with it, walking through the biblical defenses of the Trinity, things like that. And as you can see, we have some other tabs here. That's for later tonight. That's the thing there. The other thing, if you haven't heard, in the Global Methodist world where I'm coming out of, there's been a recent proposal of 15 articles, and there will be discussions happening in several different groups. There's already been a fairly big discussion happening on that. I've put my own thoughts up on Facebook. I did a live stream last week talking about some of my own thoughts. You can go hear my thoughts there. I know there will be a round table on Jeffrey Rickman's channel. I believe there's one scheduled for tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'm not sure yet if there's going to be more. If there's not, then there's not. If there is, there is. But go and check out that and find these other places if you're interested in such things. As for us, tonight, we'll be looking at Genesis 5, and then we'll have some time open up to just sort of general Q&A here. And we'll be delving into the controversial conversation of age of the age of the earth here. Everybody's favorite. I see two people in my chat are going to be on the panel. So you guys have fun. Like I said, you guys feel free to steal from my own public thoughts already, since I won't be there tomorrow, unfortunately. Just going to be be tied up at work. But as for us, I'll show this really quick before we get in here. So we're going to read through Genesis 5. We're going to read through everybody's favorite here. I guess I have to stop sharing that screen in order to share this screen. One of these days, I'll figure it out. What I highly recommend for people is get Logos Bible software. They're not paying me for this. This is completely free. See, I don't even subscribe. Subscribing pays off fast for this month's free book worth $19.90. They also have a monthly free book you can get apart from a subscription. The reason I'm highly recommending Logos is not only can you pull up things like this, you can turn on the interlinear and you'll have the Hebrew text in this case, or Greek if it's in the Greek. If you're wanting to work with the languages, if you want just the text, as you'll see here, right, here's the text of Genesis, and then here are parallel translations. I don't know if this has always been a feature. It's one I just found out about today. But this is like a parallel Bible where you have different translations side by side, and you can compare them quickly while you're reading them. That's very helpful. Another great feature, one I really like, is this sort of thing that I set up here, where you're referencing right here, this little O, and you can see cross-references, but over here, it also pulls up cross-references and related important passages to what we're talking about over here. This is one of the things that's really, really helpful for studying. So, when you're off on your own and you're doing studies, this is a powerful software to be using if you have the option. It's also available in a web browser nowadays. It used to be just the app. Now you can actually open it. I thought I stopped sharing that. Now you can open that in just the web browser. You don't actually have to download the app anymore. I don't know if it impacts functionality, but it does. It does impact, or it does impact that you can actually have it there instead of having to download it on a desktop or something. They also have a phone app if you're so inclined to doing it on mobile. Clearly, that will limit what you can and can't do because trying to have two split screen up on a phone is going to be much harder. Speaking of phones, I don't even know where mine is, so I was going to hold it up. But we're going to get here into Genesis 5, and we'll read from the text because we're going to be doing that. And as boring as it will be, bear with me because this will be very much worth it, I promise, as we get through. Hopefully this will give some great insights into how to approach the genealogies, and like all of Scripture, they're here for our benefit. So this is a total, I believe, of 32 verses. Indeed. So this is, if you haven't kept up with what we've done so far, we've gone through the story of creation, the fall, the murder of Abel, and showing how that connects to several themes that then proceed to run through the Bible. Then we had a little excursus on Jude, and we've had excursuses along the way. We're getting here into Genesis 5. This is the written account of Adam's line, his bloodline. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them man, as in mankind. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. And after he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Canaan. And after he became the father of Canaan, Enosh lived 850 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived 905 years, and then he died. I think you're going to get the point there in the genealogies. He lived X amount of years, and then he died. This brings us, and it continues in this pattern. We'll jump forward here to verse 31. It says, altogether, we'll start in verse 30. After Noah was born, who will be the important figure in the next one, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived 770 years and then died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In verse 29, you also get what the name of Noah means. As it tells us here, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord had cursed. So you'll notice this, and we'll talk about this a lot when we go through Genesis 6 through 9 next time. Even here in the genealogy, it's pulling a lot from Genesis 1 through 3. You see this creation language being used repeatedly again and again. This sets up a very important pattern that we're going to talk about next week. Just pointing that out to you now while you're hearing the genealogies. If you go back, and I recommend you do this on your own, when you read the genealogies of Cain in Genesis 4, which we talked about last time we were in Genesis, you'll notice that they're slightly different. Right here in Abel's genealogy, we're getting this just very basic. He lived, he had children, he died. He lived, he had children, he died. When you see Cain's, there's actually stuff going on in Cain's, right? Cain laid with his wife. She gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, which he named it after his son Enoch. This is not the same Enoch that walked with God. So Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehual. Mehual was the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah the father of Lamech. Lamech married 2 women, yada, yada, yada. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and flute. Then he had a son named Tubal and Cain who forged all kinds of tools, right? These people, they're building cities, they're playing instruments, they're working with metal. And then in Adam's bloodline, in Seth's bloodline, there's nothing going on. Talk a little bit about that. It's just a strange feature. Now, call me old school. This week I have it written down in the book. I've had this written down for some time. And I'm pulling, like I hinted at earlier, heavily from this book, All the Genealogies of the Bible by Nancy Dawson. If you don't know this book, you can find interviews of it up online with Nancy Dawson. And she co-wrote it with Eugene Merrill and Andreas Kostenberger. This was a work of 20 years. Disciple Dojo has a really good interview up on it. But it's walking through the genealogies and a lot of their implications here. For this, I will go ahead and pull up this here, right? We see the names comparing the line of Cain with the line of Abel. And you'll see, right, some of these names overlap. There's 2 Lamechs, there's 2 Enochs, stuff like this. Enoch, also very similar. Mahalalel, Mehual, Methuselah, right? There's a lot of overlaps here. But it's worth discussing the genealogies in their own right as just a literary genre. So genealogies are their own distinct form. They can and do tie into the narratives, like we've just seen. We see this happen with Philo, Josephus, Wisdom of Solomon, Jubilees, and Jude. They also pull from these, and they also note in either their commentaries on the genealogies or like we saw with Jude, where he'll simply pull something out from these. And they're seen as this way of tying Cain to the wickedness of the flood. If you read a lot of the ancient commentaries from ancient Jewish sources and the church fathers, when they're going through Genesis 4 and Genesis 5, they're making comments and saying this is showing what's about to be happening in the flood narrative we're going to be reading. That as these things are happening, there's wickedness already brewing within these people. But they can also speak to the honor or shame of a person, to the family or a people group, right? So if you're familiar with the biblical story, then these names stand out to you. If you're new to the biblical story, especially in ancient Israel, you're hearing these names and you're supposed to be thinking, especially with who they're related to Adam, then to Seth. This is not the line of Cain we read about. Those people were wicked. They're related to Cain. We know that they're bad news. How are these people who are related to Adam and Seth going to be? Are these going to be the ones who continue the promise of Genesis 3? Are they going to be faithful servants? If you're familiar with the story, you hear about Noah's descendants, and you know immediately who those people are. They're the enemies of the Israelites in one camp, and then faithful children on another side. So you're aware you're about to get a history that's going to matter for these other figures. They also serve a very important function, biblically speaking. So this is where biblical genealogies will stand out as opposed to other forms of genealogical literature in the ancient world. In the Bible, they are important for tracing and authenticating the messianic line. So they're tracing the bloodline of Jesus, basically, all the way from Genesis 3, all the way into the New Testament. That's what's happening as they pop up again and again. And this is shown by the fact that most genealogies are segmented and not linear. So they're sort of more broken up than focusing on exact chronological timelines here. And I'm sorry, my handwriting is very, very small here. Right? But marginal genealogies are largely found in the tribe of Judah, Levi, and Benjamin. So, and those tribes matter in particular. But we're tracing these things, and you look at like the story of Ruth, and you think, why is this in Scripture? It's a good story. It's heartwarming. It's very refreshing right after you come out of the book of Judges. But what is Ruth doing in the story of the Bible? The answer is it's tracing the line of Jesus. And there are important narrative elements there and ways that those point forward to Christ. We'll talk about that if when we get to Ruth on this channel. But it records and preserves the genealogy in the end of Ruth that traces the line of this promise through to King David, who of course is the one that is then the next large figure of messianic promise in the biblical narrative after that early period. Because once you get to the Judges, there's not really many major messianic prophecies that are and figures that are being put forth. So that's sort of one of the primary purposes of Ruth. That's sort of the reason it's in Scripture at all. And they also consistently reveal the legal offspring by blood, adoption, or marriage. So they are also used to establish the legitimacy of a figure in question, such as they're doing with David, at least in part. So that's very, very, very important. When you're studying them, though, you have to remember to check who is who. So we already sort of saw this. I'll put this back up here, right? This is just a simple example. There's an Enoch here in Cain's genealogy. There's already an Enoch. Well, not already. There will be another Enoch we're going to hear about later in the biblical narrative who walks with God. It's not this Enoch. It's a different Enoch. You have two Methuselahs here. It's important as you're going through to if you're doing studies on these, to remember that sometimes people will have names that overlap, just like we do now. And sometimes there will be different forms of names. If you get this book, it's going to walk you through all of that here. But, here's one example. If you just hear Caleb, you're going to want to look at the context and figure out who you're talking about. Is it Caleb the Kenizzite, who is not Caleb the Hezronite, right? This is going to be things that will matter a lot. And they're also contemporaries. They're alive at the same time. That actually makes it even harder. But often Scripture itself will have these distinguishers, right? They'll mention the town of the individual. They might give an honorary title. Scripture itself will often give some indication of who these people are. Or we may see someone with multiple names. So in 1 Samuel 1:1, we have Tohu, son of Zuph, who is also Nathan, son of Zophai in 1 Chronicles 6:26. So just be on the lookout for that. That being said, these things sort of out of the way, genealogies also have their own fair share of distinct marks, especially in the ancient Near East. So they're generally patrilineal, that they're tracing the line of the father. There are exceptions, and that's worth noting, but they are exceptions. They're not the general norm. The general norm is that we're tracing this through the male seed, which then gets very interesting when you get into the New Testament with Mary being the biological mother of Jesus, but not Joseph. That's a New Testament discussion now. You also then need to place them in their genealogical context, right? So genealogies, as their own specific form of narrative, also happen in specific times and places, just like everything else in the Bible. So when you're getting a genealogy, it's generally speaking to a specific time and place, right? The genealogy of Cain and Seth, or I guess I should say Adam, are talking about the context of pre-fall, right? Up to the time of Noah. Or not pre-fall, I'm sorry, pre-flood. So up to the time of Noah. That's the context this genealogy is speaking to. It's not speaking to what comes after that flood. It stops at the flood. It's important to remember that. When you're reading these, they do speak to the story happening. That's part of the purpose they play, right? Who are these characters? What are they doing? The genealogy will help inform that story. And then also cue you that, hey, you're switching to a new part of the story. But when you're going to read them, that means you don't read like every single other text in the Bible in the same way impacted by this genealogy. Clearly, it will have some impact, right? You're tracing the line of, say, the Canaanites or the Babylonians, Well, these old genealogies might have some impact when those figures pop up again in the story, but they won't necessarily impact, say, the narratives of the prophets, stuff like that. They do also give us family ties into groups. They establish the rights of the firstborn. Now, biblically speaking, which means it matters for us, that is a very important feature of the Bible. So, firstborn isn't something as relevant in most cultures today. There are exceptions. Some cultures still carry very much about honor and shame, about who's the firstborn, especially the firstborn son. That's who's going to do a lot of what the Bible describes the firstborns and is their role in the ancient Near East. Their role in protecting their family and as being the inheritors of the promises, whether that's riches, land. They're also the one who then proceeds to hand out. They're also the one who's going to be in charge of doling out and tending to their father's house. This is an important note. Genealogies are not heterogeneous. So that's that thing we were talking about earlier, where there can be differences in individuals who have the same names. There can be differences in how individuals are named if they have the same name in later versions of their genealogy. But they also show us that the biblical authors, and this is a very important apologetic. My audio is going weird. Let me try this. Is it better now? Give me a mic check 1, 2. Is it bad now? Is it fixed now? JP the audio. I can't. I don't know what's wrong with the audio. It's good now. We're good. Okay. I guess I can't play my music then. I'll survive. Where were we? Oh yes, the use of genealogies. Well, now I might have to go back. Now it'll be fine. If someone has questions about what wasn't clear in the garble part of the audio, feel free to ask in the chat or in the comments. Back to this. So the genealogies actually show us that there is likely some form of documentation being used by at least the editors of the manuscripts that are passed down or the oral stories that are passed down. The reason we can sort of know this is because generally speaking, people would remember up to 10 generations of family history. And that's a lot of family history. It's a lot of family history. That was the realm of what someone could memorize. But we also know that these genealogies are selective. And we know that with the Genesis genealogies in particular. Let me go pull up my own past comment on this elsewhere just to make sure I'm getting the right statement here. But the genealogies are known for not being complete in the Bible and just in the ancient Near East in general. This is a feature of the biblical genealogies. So they're not interested, strictly speaking, in just giving us a point A to point B. That's sort of how modern genealogies work. That's not necessarily how ancient genealogies work. And if I can find my own past comment. So, for example, in the Genesis genealogy here, hold on, now we got to find it here. So we have this thing where we know there's a gap in the Genesis genealogy because there's a figure listed in Luke that's not listed in Genesis. In Luke 3:36, at least, lists the son of Canaan, the son of Arphaxad, the son of Shem, the son of Noah, the son of Lamech. And oh, well, now I didn't list who that individual was. Luke 3:35. So the son of Serug, the son of Ru, the son of blah, 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 right? A bunch of sons of. The point in Luke 3, and we see this with the genealogy, there's this figure who's not listed in Genesis. He's absent. It's Canaan, son of Arphaxad. He's not listed, right? When we went through that Genesis genealogy, there's a gap in the Genesis genealogy. So we know that there's an intentional gap, right? And that is one of the many things that people point to for saying there are written sources people are using, at least when they're coming to the genealogies. So, say, contra Rome, who sort of critiqued Roman sources, or contra skeptics of the faith who have charged the Bible with being made up nonsense, things like that. We see that they're not just pulling these stories out of nowhere, right? King Josiah doesn't come along and rewrite the Old Testament, as some have charged. There's written documents of some kind that are pulling on these older sources, demonstrating this, and being intentional in how they write their genealogies to make particular points, whether that's theological, whether that's historical, right? Whether that's saying these Canaanites, these Babylonians, they come from bad blood. Their wickedness starts long before they ever walked the earth with Cain, and that is where their wickedness continues to spread from. Or by no, not off Cain in their case, but by showing how their ancestors were, shows how they descendants continue to be. And this is where you get something that, at least in this book, is called literary telescoping, where you're getting this Old Testament genealogy, and there may or may not be intentional gaps, but it's also pointing forward to something that's going to come. And sometimes the genealogies are very explicit, right? They'll say, these people are now called X, and they say, hey, we're looking forward as well. They're not just looking backward here. So there are selective inclusions and this feature where they point forward in the biblical story. So the genealogies then, in light of all this, have quite a few useful things for us to be looking for. So we know that these are intentionally crafted. I can also take these off now that I'm not listening to music. You guys can look at my cube head. If there's an intention behind them, that means they're going to be trying to tell us specific things. So collectively, we know that the genealogies show the family of God, which is composed of Jews and Gentiles. As you go through the Old Testament, it's not just Jewish people who are making up the bloodlines. You get people like Rahab, Joshua, Caleb, figures who are not Jewish, being incorporated in these bloodlines, being incorporated into the people of God, who come to hold the faith of Abraham, the faith of us all, Romans 4:16. Scripture shows us that Yahweh is the God of our ancestors, and we are his sons and daughters. And we see that from places like 2 Corinthians 6, Hosea 1:10, Romans 9:20. So there's two important scriptural metaphors for family, for this specific family, this family of God that we're tracing through these genealogies. One is a house, or you could say temple, this dwelling place, and the other is the living tree of life. Both of those hopefully sound very familiar to you. So with the house being built up, we see that the physical presence of God in the tabernacle and the temple themselves point forward to God's eternal plan and of dwelling in believers. And eventually we will dwell physically in his presence. And there's a scriptural case to be made for anyone who is interested in that, but I don't think anyone in the chat right now is on the side of questioning that. But when we look at the tree, right, we show that there's this, it constitutes an organic, living, dynamic family of faith. It is here, by these genealogies and metaphors, so pairing these two things together as they're meant to be, right, they're both in the same book, we see something that the church has always needed to be emphatic on, and we especially need today. Ultimate covenant family of God is not bound by, but transcends all family, cultural, and national backgrounds. Faith in Christ becomes the final arbiter for identity, inclusion, and unity in the kingdom. So these genealogies, in a way, point forward to a truth that still lasts today, and people seek to undermine today, right? This is something that actually matters today, because there are people who want to separate the church by race, by blood, by genealogy, in a sense. Whereas God's plain truth, shown not just in explicit statements in Scripture, but also by these genealogies, he's saying, hey, you can't do that. That's not how God's kingdom works. That might be how your worldly kingdoms work. Your earthly kingdoms work that are separate from me. And we'll see that when we talk about the Tower of Babel. But that is not how God's kingdom is to work. God's kingdom is to be for all people, all places, all times. And it's being established just in the mere list of names. But Dawson, and then we won't talk about these, but Dawson also lists 19 other distinct functions of genealogies from a scriptural framework standpoint, and then 2 indirect functions. And right, so 21 functions of genealogies. If you want to learn those, go get her book. We're not going to talk about all 21 of those functions here. And this is on the historical, cultural sphere only, let alone the theological aspects and anything we've discussed already. So genealogies are serving a ton of functions in the Bible. They're not these just things thrown out there, right? They also have moral implications too. When the ancients would come to these genealogies, they weren't just looking at these as history records. They spoke about people, they spoke about morals, they had important insights. They also show us great insight into the history they are grounded in God's redemptive work, and then ultimately, of course, in Christ himself. So genealogies are a wide-scoping thing that try and teach us about morals, they try and teach us about history, they try and lay out the plan of God, the promise of God, in a way we normally wouldn't think about, just by the mere inclusion of Gentiles, by showing that God's plan, ultimately, right, there's the promise of the Messianic seed coming through one line, but you have all these other families that God's working through that aren't part of the Messianic line, but are still important stories in the Bible and inform the image of God's redemptive plan. So the genealogies are going to be boring, but a book that will help you get through them is this one right here. Genealogies of the Bible by Nancy Dawson, Eugene Merrill, and Andreas Kostenberger. And we're going to do a little bit of that here with Genesis 4 through 5. We're going to be intentional here and, I'm hoping to try and point some things out here. So this is just an image I found online. You can see the URL here. I don't know why they made it. I just grabbed this quickly. So in Genesis 4, right, we get Cain and Lamech in chapter 4. The reason that a lot of ancient commentators would look at Genesis 4 and comment on how the genealogy itself is pointing to the corruption of the world. So when we get through Genesis 6 through 9, it speaks about that the fact that the world is corrupt. If we look at its exact language, I really should have just kept this open, huh? That would have made more sense, or just used logos. But Genesis 5 is the genealogy. Genesis 4 ends with the genealogy. And this is sort of telling us, hey, we're moving to a new part of the story. But then we get to Genesis 6. When man began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful. They married any of them they chose. Lots of discussion to be had on who that is. We're not going to deal with that here. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. Then Nephilim were on the earth, everybody's favorite, in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. What's missing from Genesis 6 there is a discussion of how the world became so wicked. You don't get it from the text itself. It just notes that it became wicked. What you get instead are these genealogies. That's the thing that's in between the story of Cain and Abel and the story that leads to the flood. And right before the genealogy in Genesis 4, we get the story of what Lamech does. Not the story, the statement. Where was it? Yes. So in Genesis 4, 23, we get a speech from Lamech. We get this genealogy, and then we get the speech from Lamech. He said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And then it immediately moves into the genealogy of Adam. So what a lot of the commentators point out here, as you read through Genesis 4 and you hear of them working with musical instruments, building cities, forging, all things that appear again when we talk about the Tower of Babel, commentators point to that and go, this is an intentional literary design showing that this genealogy is showing us how the wickedness is growing. And we wouldn't think of that in how we read modern genealogies. We would read that and think, oh, these are people who did things. When the ancients read this, they said, these people were doing these things and somehow it led to wickedness. How did it lead to wickedness? We need to discuss that. And the answer is they were doing it apart from God. That's why we see Lamech say, if Cain was avenged sevenfold by God, that's part of God's promise to Cain as he sends him out into exile. If someone harms you, you will be avenged sevenfold. If someone kills you, you will be avenged. Lamech says, I will do this. This will be done 77 times. And not by God's hand, by his own hand. He will take this vengeance. And this is a tip-off that as you go through that genealogy, when you're looking at what these people are doing, they're not doing so by the grace of God. They're not doing so by the power of God. They're not doing so by being faithful servants of God. They're doing so by their own power, their own means, their own will. They're going and doing what they want to do. That's why, just like in the Tower of Babel, we hear of them building cities, right? The Lord told the people, spread out, multiply, and fill the earth. With Cain, we see him go build a city that acts as his fortress, isolating him from the world around him. And through this defiance to God's command, wickedness begins to spread. That's what leads us into the story of Genesis 6, where the people are so wicked, God unmakes creation. He sort of, I like how Tim Mackey put it in the recent podcast, creation collapses in on itself. There was the waters above that were separated in Genesis 1-3. This makes the heavens, and the waters below, the sea. It's almost like in the flood that separation's removed as the whole earth floods and those waters meet, and it undoes the creation beneath it. But that's what the ancients saw in the genealogy of Genesis 4. And I mean, going as far back as we have commentaries on it, and arguably from biblical commentaries, or I should say biblical comments, seem to paint that same image. That's what's the interim story of Genesis 4 and 5, that these genealogies are showing us who is being faithful and who is being faithless. This is why when we get to Noah, it's no surprise that he is called righteous and blameless, like we'll be talking about. So there's a literary connection to the flood story that's about to follow. And almost always, when you have genealogies in the biblical narrative that are inserted between narratives, that's part of their function. They're telling you there's a switch happening in the story, and what's happening in the genealogy is related to that story that's about to happen. And several have also pointed out, Lamech's alive leading up to the flood. He's the last in Cain's line. We see over here, well, almost the last in Cain's line. He's got some sons here. He's alive for at least part of the period leading up to the flood. Not this Lamech, though. I suppose this Lamech would also be alive here as well. It's also typologically significant that Seth's name means replacement or substitute. Yeah, there's a faithful Enoch and a faithless Enoch. And that's sort of how we can think about quite a few of these things. But when we get to Seth in Genesis 5, his name means replacement or substitute. This is to replace the child that Cain murdered. We could replace Abel. This chart is really nicely laid out here. So Cain slays the righteous Abel, and through the substitute, the promise of redemption comes. That's the language that's painted here. Just as a substitute comes in Genesis 22, when we talk about Abraham and his son Isaac, and ultimately Christ, the firstborn. Just as there are firstborns here. And for wondering, both of them are painted as firstborns. Abel is painted as a firstborn of a line that ended. Seth is painted as this firstborn of the righteous line. Cain is the firstborn of the wicked line. It's almost like when, in the biblical story, when Cain separates himself from God, it's like this bloodline gets cut off and separated and becomes the bloodline of the serpent instead of the bloodline of Adam. But this substitute language itself points forward to Christ and shows this theme that starts popping up again and again and again throughout the Bible. And we'll talk about the harmony of Scripture when we get to Genesis 6. So we see this repeated theme of a firstborn, of sacrifice, of substitute, and opposition from the line of the wicked with the righteous. So it's not just that this line over here is being wicked and unfaithful. It's they're in active opposition to the righteous line and the righteousness of God. So there's also a bunch of similarities and differences in the genealogies, right? So we have the removal of Cain in these lines, as I've talked about here. And there are I already talked about the gaps here. So, oopsies, let me close that real quick. So you'll notice, as we've talked about, there's this paralleling here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then these act sort of like a seventh. 7 on this side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on this side. Numbers matter in the Bible. 7 is the number of completeness, wickedness. We see here 7 would also be the number of completeness, but it's like there's an abundance over here. Like there's an abundance. Yeah, the names being so similar is also disturbing. Like Cain's line is a mockery of the righteous cousins. That is very true. Now, I made a note to myself to consult her footnotes. So I should do that really quick. Like I said, I have not... I prepared this about a month ago. So there has been some time in between here. And I guess I can actually show you this while I'm flipping through this here. So we'll go back to Genesis 4 through 5 here. I'll remove my little bookmark here just to show you how hers also sort of sets this up, right? This is one genealogy following it in a straight line. See this other side, there's the text. You see the two-sided genealogy there at the top. But she's got plenty of helpful notes in here. Let me see if I can find the specific note I was talking about here. So most importantly, she has charts. The charts are incredibly helpful. Those are worth doing here, or worth having just for the charts in this book. It's worth having here. I don't see whatever it was I was referencing when I wrote down these notes, so we're going to have to skip over that. All right. But just as there are some similarities here, right? We have overlaps of some names. We have some overlaps of various lines here. There's this very notable difference between the two bloodlines. So Cain's line, when you go through it, when you read through Genesis 4, the genealogy doesn't end with, and then he died. I don't know if anyone noticed that. When you're reading through the genealogies, the bloodline of Cain's line doesn't end with, and then he died, as you're going through it. I really got to stop closing this, guys. But when you go through the bloodline of the righteous, there's this constant statement, and then he died, and then he died, and then he died. Right? So Lamech married 2 women. There he had Adar, he had Zillah, he had Jabal, right? But there's no talk of their deaths. Some people have interpreted this to mean they're all still alive during the flood. Let people interpret that how they will. But Enosh lived 905 years, and then he died. Kenan, 910, and then he died. Mahalalel, 895 years, and then he died. It's this almost disturbing difference between the two genealogies, that we see the wicked are not being said to be dying in these genealogies, that they're seeming to live long and prosperous and not have this concern of death. Whereas in the genealogies of the righteous, well, the righteous are dying. There's this gap between them. There's this gap between them. And I wrote down to see a note in the Net Bible, which is currently buried but beneath a bunch of text. So I'm going to pull up this and hope I can... that's going to take too long. This is why I need to be more organized, ladies and gentlemen. I need to be more organized. So this is the Net Bible, Full Notes Edition, physical, if you've never seen it here. It is available online. It's a study tool I've talked about a fair bit. Maybe I should have pushed this back just to get all my stuff in order. But here we are. Page 16. Note Q. So the net on Note Q says the genealogy, talking about Genesis 5, traces the line from Adam to Noah and forms a bridge between the earlier accounts and the flood story. Its constant theme of the reign of death in the human race is broken once with the account of Enoch, but the genealogy ends with hope for the future Noah. So we have this constant refrain, and then there was death, and then there was death, and then there was death. But then when you get to Noah, you're told his name means this one will bring us comfort from our labor and from the painful toil of our hands because of the ground that the Lord has cursed. This is clearly hearkening back to the Genesis language, Genesis 3, especially with the curses and the promise of the Messianic seed. There's this clear painting. Hey, here's this righteous figure. Keep an eye on him. This is the one that the story is going to go on with. And then there's some works you can read further if you want to. There's G.F. Hassel's The Genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, if you are so inclined to read more on the genealogies. So we have this image of death that then is offset by the righteous one, who will be the one who brings comfort. You can hopefully hear how that points forward to Jesus there himself. But like Shem's genealogy, it also stands out because lifespans are integrated to it, unlike other genealogies. So when, and Dawson and Merrill note this as well in their genealogy. I actually wrote down which note to read from here. When you're going through a lot of the genealogies in the Bible, they don't always list these lifespans. And I note this when in my own work on Genesis 23, right? Sarah is the only woman in the whole Bible who gets the formula of she lived so and so years and then died. No other woman in the whole Bible gets that. But many men in the Bible also don't get that formula. So the genealogy, like that of Shem in Genesis 11, is unique then that the lifespans and paternity of their ancients are considered as an integral part of the genealogical record here. So the genealogy is not just naming the people, it decides that the lifespans are important enough to be noted here. And that sort of matters in the offset when we see these. Where was I going with that? When we see throughout the Bible, there is this care placed into what's placed in these things. Why does the age matter here? Well, as we get in the story of Genesis 6, the age of man gets sort of limited because of the wickedness of others. And I did actually write in my own little notebook here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So mine's a little different than the one you're going to see on the screen. I'll actually hide this so it's a little easier to see here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to Lamech here. And then sort of offshoots and, these kids. And then Seth, Enosh, right? You can see my own little, you can't see my mouse, but you can see how we've sort of drawn forth those parallels there. So hopefully that's some helpful insights here. And I do have this other chart as well, just showing sort of potential, not potential. Yeah, there's this count. Now, we are going to talk about young Earth here because they talk about this here. But you can see from what we know of the genealogies and ages listed, at least in the life of Noah, right? You see that there are a lot of overlap. What's happening in these bloodlines up to the flood, and then it has this like hard cutoff. This hard cutoff. I'm going to close this out. So just to talk about the age of the earth, because we're here and it's an important matter to talk about, I'm going to take my glasses off for a second. I'm of the conviction, and I know not everyone's going to agree with this, no matter what stance I take, it's going to offend someone on the internet. That's what it is. Someone's going to call me a radical liberal. Someone's going to call me a radical conservative. Is what it is. I also don't expect that many views on a video about the genealogy of the Bible. That's neither here nor there, though. But I'm of the conviction that the Bible itself isn't telling us how old the earth is. When you go through the story of Genesis, that's not the point of the story. It's not a science textbook. I understand some people are already shaking their fist at me. The story of Genesis 1 through 3 is not concerned with how old the earth is. That's not the point of the story. Genesis 1 through 11 is not concerned with how old the earth is. It's telling us the story of God's creation, his creation as good, and then mankind's ruination of it, and then the ensuing acts of judgment for man's wickedness. This sets up this repeated story and image that pops up throughout the Bible. It's called the harmony of Scripture by some. Tim Mackey uses that language. He has a video on the book of Job. Go watch that if you're interested in that. Otherwise, we'll be talking about it when we get to Genesis 6 through 11. Josh, you radical moderate. This is the best thing anyone has ever said. When you're going through, you see these stories of Genesis 1 through 11, but 1 through 4 especially start popping up again and again and again. That same language starts to get used. Yes, exactly this, right? Genesis 1 is not telling us, hey, the earth is so and so years old. It's telling us God made these stars, these lights, these moons. These are not deities. These are created things under the absolute sovereignty of God. Go watch my video on Genesis 1, and you'll hear me talk about that. The other thing we get is Genesis 1 and 2 have differences in how they're telling their creation account. Now, that doesn't mean that they're false stories. That doesn't mean they're unreliable accounts. But it does clue us into the fact that how the ancients told history is not like how we tell history. This is known. We have, I believe it's Ptolemus. He was a Greek historian who wrote biographies. I saw a giant pile of his biographies this past weekend. I almost bought them. I was very tempted, but you can find them free online, so I didn't. And this is just in Greece, so much later. But we know that when he writes biographies, he will sometimes change details between the biographies, even if they're on the same person. Why? Because it's emphasizing different things. We still do this with movies today. When we have movies on historical tales, I'm not part of the Calvary Chapel movement. I have some respect for the people in there, but Chuck Lowry, when he was involved with the making of the movie over the Jesus movement, Jesus Freaks, whatever they were called, that led to Calvary Chapel, he himself notes that when they filmed the movie, they condensed things, they changed timelines, they changed how some scenes were told for the sake of the narrative, for the sake of the movie, because they had to condense things. We see Ptolemy will change details to highlight either the morality of a figure, the immorality of a figure, highlight certain events happening in certain places. We see that same thing is probably happening just with ancient historical tales in general. They're still very true. They're still very true. Ooh, Quattro, you might have to share this essay. So when Genesis 1 and 2 have differences in some of their minor details, that's a clue that this isn't a literal, in the biggest air quotes you can possibly put there, literal story. It's still literal history. Literal just means reading it as it's intended. It's historical prose. In Genesis 1, we have light around the world before the separation of sun and day and night. There's still light. Now, if you want to say that clearly God is the light and reading it in light of Revelation, that's fine. But you're no longer reading it literally in the original context that a lot of people want to really press on. So you're already changing how you're reading it to accommodate for this fact. And a lot of people will then want to also talk about, it's never as simple as we like. Never is. Want to talk about the genealogies. Well, these genealogies have gaps, and we don't know how big those gaps are. We don't know how long those gaps are. We don't know how many gaps there are. We just don't have that information. The Bible literally, as far as I can tell, isn't telling us the age of the earth at all. Now, some people want to say that means we can read this and then say there's a limit to how old the earth can be. You know what? That's a fine conversation to be having, but you can't be dogmatic on it. You can't sit here and say the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old and then condemn people who disagree with you on that. You can't. Now, someone who's disagreeing needs to be able to point out things from the Bible to show this, right? Like I've done here tonight. I talked about Canaan, son of Arphaxad, who's not in the original Genesis genealogy. So we know there's at least one gap. we have differences in the creation accounts, this doesn't undermine their historical accountings. It just means that when the Bible is telling us this literal history, it's doing so in the way of ancient writing, which is not modern writing in history. Just not modern writing in history. Exactly stuff like this. And you'll find tons of differences. So not only do I have a video on Genesis 1, I know I also have a playlist called, I'm actually going to go double check this playlist name. The Bible is History, Not Myth. And it was largely inspired by the book by John Oswalt, The Bible Among the Myths. It's a book I cannot recommend enough. I love the book, and it's going through and pointing out, comparing the Bible to the ancient Near East. Yeah, why the Bible and not the ball cycle? And comparing it to all these different myths around, and creation stories and flood stories and all sorts of other things. And it's showing how the Bible is unique compared to these other things in a way that shows its truthfulness. That's an important conversation to have. It mattered a lot more, probably until pretty recently. I mean, there's still a large part of the world that's having that conversation. I just don't hear about it as much as I used to. The ball cycle is wild. It is a wild story, but you can absolutely go and read it. But that is it for the genealogies. I had my little spiel on the age of the earth. I don't think the Bible is dogmatic on it, so we shouldn't be super hardcore dogmatic on it. What we should be concerned with is, are people denying fundamental biblical truths? Are they denying historical Adam and Eve? Are they denying that God is the creator of the world and that God is sovereign and he knows all things? Are they an open theist? Stuff like this in relation to these Genesis tales. Are they denying the fall as an historical event and original sin as the consequence of it? Those things are demonstrable from the tale. It is telling a historical account. It's simply doing so with ancient historical methods of telling tales. It's funny. John Oswalt points out that the Bible is the closest thing in the ancient Near East to historical telling as we have it today. Go read his book for more on that. I'll not be expanding on that here tonight. I'm going to make everybody go read John Oswalt's book. Go make everybody read John Oswalt's book. But that's it. Does anyone have any questions, anything like that? I know I started a little earlier than normal just because I'm tired and I have a lot to do. I'll be preaching the rest of this month. I had the very great privilege of preaching for Easter. And I'll be filling in a pulpit near me for a pastor who's having back surgery. For anyone who doesn't know what I sort of do, so I work in security for a day job, my tent making, as it were. And then I do ministry work, whether that's here online or apprenticing at the church I'm apprenticing at. I'm assisting with, we're calling it adult confirmation, young adult confirmation, where we're teaching high schoolers and people who've converted after, and anyone else who wants to show up, really. Taking them through confirmation, not just the basics of the Christian faith, but also the basics of Methodism. It's off camera. Barely off camera. You can sort of see the edges right here. The basics of the Wesleyan way, or the absolute basics of the Wesleyan way, and the absolute basics of Christianity. It's titled something like those. It's from one of the creators of VeggieTales, Talon, Phil Talon, I think. And phenomenal books. Highly recommend them. They are, for what they say they are, the absolute basics. So you're not getting intense theological treatises, but they're very good. And that's two of the books that we're using to help teach class, and we're going through some other stuff. I'm not hardline. So it depends on what you mean by historicity. So by historicity, I would take these as a genuine accounting that there was creation, there was a fall, the world was so wicked that a flood happened. Now, that doesn't mean it was a global flood. There's a conversation to be had there. I certainly lean towards a global flood. There's fair discussion to be had there, but the biblical narrative itself actually doesn't demand that, because the language of the whole world is used repeatedly throughout the Bible, Old and New Testaments, when it wasn't talking about the whole world. And we know that exaggeration happens in not just in the Bible, but tons of ancient literature. That's just a common feature of ancient literature. Another example of that's like the book of Joshua, where I think it's Joshua 11 through 15 in particular I'm thinking about, but might be expanded beyond that, where it'll talk about an entire group of people being entirely destroyed, utterly decimated. They were no more. This exaggerated war language, and then a few chapters later, Israel fighting them again. So, the Hebrews are fighting them again. This is before the Israelites, I believe. So, there's this exaggeration in the language, but it is telling a generally reliable historical account. And the reason I would make that case in particular is because as we go through the prophets and then we get to the New Testament, it speaks of these as historical realities that actually happened. Now we can talk about the details of what is present in those and how it's telling that history. But I think we do need to affirm, at least in the bare minimum, they are historical events in some capacity. In the brook Kishon, I know there is, at least with the Exodus, I know Disciple Dojo is a big fan. He's been pushing James Michael Smith. For anyone who doesn't know, go follow Disciple Dojo. He's great. The I can't remember the name, but there's a third route in the Exodus, that's been proposed for the Exodus route. So there's two main ones that everyone talks about. They're normally in all the big study Bibles. Let me go see if this one has maps in Exodus, because if they're in the back, I guess I have time to filter while I'm yapping here. But his idea, yeah, here we are. Well, that text is a little small for my old man eyes at the moment. I need to go see my eye doctor. There's some stuff going on with my eyes. You can see here, this is the Reflecting God Study Bible. This map here, I think these are the Genesis routes. Yeah, these are Exodus routes. Trade route, Israelite route. So they have, it looks like, is this only one proposed route? Take a screenshot. They might only be proposing one route here. I think they're only proposing one route here. Oh, never mind. This doesn't have it. But there are two popular routes that most people talk about, and then there's a third one that would end up going through an area in a mountain that no one's been exploring and excavating. And of course, in the past, there's been chances to explore that area. The way things are in the Middle East right now, probably not. This has been a common thing with the Middle East. There will be periods where things will be open and archaeologists can go in and do a lot of work. But because of how turbulent things are, not just in one area, the entire Middle East, and I'm not joking there, they'll go through periods of having active archaeological digs and then have to shut things down, leave, and then wait for things to calm down before they head back in. And sometimes this has resulted in ruins being destroyed by warfare or other parties, looting happening from digs that were protected and not found yet, but then they found them and had to leave them for their own safety. Though I saw this and it reminded me. So, talk about the young age of the earth. Methodism itself is having there's people who want to have that discussion, people who don't, and then people who are snobs about it, and people who aren't. But I'll be talking about Methodist reform via two books soon. So we'll go with this one first, because this will be the first interview. This is exploring the saddlebags of classic Methodism. There's a saddlebag. So saddlebag is a reference to the circuit riders who would ride around on horses and would have circuits of churches they would visit as priests. They'd empower laity and others to, hello, Adam. Empower laity to handle preaching and such and pastoral care of the congregation while they were gone. And the circuit riders' primary job was to ride around, make sure churches are staying in good shape, but they were primarily focused on, they'd come in, they'd preach, they administer the sacrament. That was one of their primary purposes, because there was a shortage on pastors then, just like there is now. So pastors, these circuit riders, would come through, offer the sacrament, and attend to the spiritual well-being, especially of the ministers that they had in their place, since they had to go and attend to many churches. Sort of like a mini bishop. That's not quite a good analogy, but it's close. So this book, Exploring the Saddlebags of Classic Methodism, of course, it's Vic Reasoner. He's part of the Wesley Fundamental Society, or Fundamental Wesleyan Society. I'm also part of this society. We don't agree on everything. I love Vic, and I'm sure he knows we don't agree on everything. But I'll be talking to him about his book, and it's going through the historic doctrine and practices of the Methodist movement. So orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And it's very simple, right? He's just saying very condensed. Here is, we affirm free grace. So I'll just read a little bit from this for example. This is page 10. Wesley ascribed all good to the free grace of God. He denied all natural free will and all human ability prior to God's preliminary grace. Therefore, justification must be by grace through faith alone. The transformation of grace in our life excludes any personal merit. And then, of course, he talks about Wesleyan and Arminianism over Calvinism, but he's not using illustrations. There's not a bunch of examples. He's being clear, concise, and to the point. And that's how you have such a little book about things that some people have written much thicker books on. Because he's not that, I don't want to call those other books using fluff, because illustrations, examples, historical context, those things matter. Vic Reasoner's getting to the very, very core bare bones. And then and that's about the first third of the book. And then the second part of the book, if I can cut to it, is quite a few pages basically of resource material. So there's some context added in, but he talks about primary sources, Wesley's notes on the Bible, Wesley's sermons. Here's what they are, Wesley's Christian library. Here's some of the important things out of them. And then he talks about important Methodist figures. Here's their important work. Here's the biggest work that had the most influence, and then goes through a history. So if you want to just have the bullet points of, hey, here are the historic doctrines and practices, they're here in this book. And then there is a bunch of discussion on the sources that you can go to, primary and secondary, to read more on those things and see how it develops. And this is, of course, part of Vic Reasoner's effort. As he puts it here, the next Methodism must build on the foundation laid by the founders rather than the liberal foundation of the previous Methodism, which collapsed. In order to move forward, we must go back to the primary sources. This book is an introduction to classic Methodist teaching and then an exploration of classic Methodist literature. Short, sweet, to the point. And I'll be talking to him about this book and his thoughts on Methodism moving forward. It's not going to be me trying to debate him or critique him or engage him on points where we disagree. It's just me trying to have discussions with some Methodists on what they think the vision of Methodism's for moving forward and what it is we should be talking about. And I've given plenty of my own thoughts about that on the channel. For anyone interested, there's a playlist called Methodist Reform on the channel for people wanting that. Another book from someone who's still in the Methodist world, the two people, but are not quite on the same end of the spectrum as Vic, and that is Doctors David and Kevin Watson. So Watson and Watson wrote Faith and Fire. I love wordplay and alliteration, but of course their names weren't intentional wordplay, but they did comment. It was fun to have a book by Watson and Watson, but it just felt fun. F and F, W and W. There's also an interesting tale. I don't know if I'll bring this up in because I'll be interviewing David Watson for sure. We're hoping to be able to get Kevin on theirs too. It just depends on if everyone's schedules will line up. And it's a similar book, right? Faith and Fire. You can see a Methodist preacher there. It's the same type of discussion. What is the focus of Methodism? Let's have to talk about its history, and let's talk about Methodism moving forward. And not everyone, but many people have thoughts about what Methodism needs to do moving forward. This is me talking to David Watson and hopefully also Kevin Watson about their thoughts on what Methodism needs to do moving forward, because not everyone agrees, and we need to be having conversations about different visions people have. And I think we in the broader body then need to be discussing, at least the Methodist world, how is it we want to then be handling these conversations? What are we wanting to pull on? What are we agreeing with? What are we not agreeing with? And you see this book's also a little bit thicker. For a little foretaste of this, book in the interview, if you want to go listen to, I'm not sure if it's available online. I think it is David Watson's inauguration speech when he was instituted as president of Asbury Theological Seminary, my seminary this past year. This book was a sort of behind the mind there of David Watson as he was giving a speech. I think that's all I have to yap on about. I can't think of anything else at this moment. So does anyone have any questions or anything? I'm good to go for a little bit longer, but if no one has questions, always good to end it a little early. Get to end it a little early. I just wish my Heresy Hunter t-shirts. Oh no! Listen, heresy hunting is not great. This is a conversation worth having. We need to be sure, even in the midst of strong disagreements, to be leading with grace, um, and to be leading with the way we think Christ would be wanting us to lead a discussion. Not necessarily lead as in lead a movement, but lead as in how are we handling a discussion ourselves. So I'm going to take the articles of the Methodists that you can go find my Facebook post. You can go watch my video. One of the things I've critiqued is there's a lot of ambiguity in these articles. And I've heard that from a lot of people. That's not just me. A bunch of people are noting that the articles became a lot vaguer, with at least the proposed articles are a lot vaguer. These are not instituted yet. And, one of the things I'm pushing for is we need to have at least a 2-year public discourse on these articles. It shouldn't be that this is an important and related side point. Leaders in the Global Methodist, if you listen to this or watch this, I mean this with sincerity, love, and charity. We have to stop pushing things out right before conferences or at a conference and then saying we're going to discuss this here. We need to be putting these things out publicly well beforehand, at least a year, and then having at least a year of public discourse on it. But we don't just need to discuss the product that's being proposed. We also need an understanding of the why, So the articles are a lot bigger. Is that because we want the Global Methodist Church to be a big tent? Does everybody in the Global Methodist Church want it to be a bigger tent? Is that something we want? Is that something, because there are plenty of Methodists who don't want that. I'm one of them. I want Methodism to be Methodism. I want us to be distinct as the Methodist movement. I don't want us to be just another generic evangelical group in America. Well, I say America in the modern cultural context of a very westernized world. And that's what these articles proposed seem to be doing. Like, yes, there is discussion of sanctification and grace, but like, there's not even a definition of what grace is in these articles. It's not clear that it's different than, say, the semi-Pelagian definition of grace, which does include God's supernatural grace and supernatural gifting, but they also include human reason and logic. Like that's what the provisionists, the modern day semi-Pelagians, are doing. Is that something we want? Is that something we're okay with? I'm not. I think we need to be very clear what grace is, and I think we need to be very clear what is distinct about Methodism in our confession. And if our 15 articles are less clear and more ambiguous than the 25 articles, I think that's a failure. And I don't say that to be harsh. I think the people behind the articles are theologically sound overall. I don't think they intended anything malicious in these articles. But I think there's a very big difference in the conversation happening behind closed doors that someone like myself is not aware of, and what's being put out into the public. And not knowing what's happening, not knowing motivations, not knowing the conversations that were had, there's no way to evaluate that mindset that's happening behind it and the intentions and the motivations that we need to be having conversations on. Because if we have a bunch of people in the Global Methodist world wanting to talk about reform and how we're moving forward, it's really hard for people to show grace and charity when we don't know why you're talking about certain things the way you are and why you're putting forth certain things. Why is it these articles are formulated in this way? And if we go to like the proposed statement that was up on, I think it was August of 2025, maybe it was 2024, where it gave like the criteria for what's happening on the panel. One of them was, if there's not a unanimous consensus on an article proposal, it'll be voted on. Something that would be very helpful is not only would we like returning to the minute style from the conferences where we have privy to the conversation, at least give us a summarized statement of the intention of what was the gist of the conversation that happened. And was it unanimous or did it come down to a vote? How many people voted yes or no? How many of the articles were a consensus vote versus a vote, or a consensus decision versus a vote that had to be put through? How big were the percentages on people who were for it up front and against it up front? How many changes were made and why were those changes made? Knowing those things enables us to have a conversation that can be a lot more productive than here's our proposal for 15 articles without any context, and then we're just evaluating them, not quite in a void, but devoid of a lot of the context of the conversation that happened leading up to those, and the intention for the vision that they're putting forward. What is the positive goal of these articles? What is their actual end goal? Because if it's just Big Tent Methodism, well, is becoming ambiguous and clear and less clear the way we want to do that. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. But I also don't know if that's the goal, because the motivations and such weren't just publicly shared. And we have, I'm on a webcam right now. It's not too difficult to just, even if it's just one person as a representative, it's like, hey, go fire up a live stream this day, a month out, and have it open to the public for conversation, but give our thoughts, give our statements. Here's why we propose these things in these ways, and then answer questions. Answering questions is a great way to clear up ambiguities that we don't know. I don't know. Thoughts on increasing patristics. What does IJ mean? Is that, I'm guessing that's supposed to be in Methodism. Do you mean like patristic studies, or returning to like patristic practices? What do you mean by that? This one, I did a little bit of research into this because I know there's the okay, it was in. So yeah, so by patristics you mean study or practices. The names, so like one of the theories is that I've heard put on the internet, I don't think it's true, is like if you take the names of one of the genealogies and lay them out. Actually, I can just look it up, Genesis 5 genealogy, and it'll pull up. Yeah, I'll share this one. So this is the one. I don't know who this is. Where'd the genealogy image go? Well, that didn't work. Here we go. So this is one of the ones I've seen. I've heard this theory many times. If you were to take out the meaning of the names, you would get a messianic prophecy tucked away in the names. So man, and of course they have to supply word. Man appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down, teaching his death shall bring despairing comfort rest. So I know Methuselah's name is not his death shall bring. It is not the meaning of Methuselah's name. That is, we also know that's not what Noah's name means, because we get a little bit lengthier definition from this. But I believe Methuselah's name roughly means what was it? Throws man of the dart. That's what it was. Man of the dart. Now you could understand that is in, right, he throws the dart, something comes with him. It's man who sends, something like that, or man who brings. But it's technically man of the dart. So I know like that theory falls short in a few ways, but there is certainly worth in studying the names of the genealogies. Those will have important meanings. Yes, this is also one of the reasons myself and others are not a fan of the Big Tent, because we've seen what happened, at least in America, with the Big Tent movements. A lot of Methodists are talking about we want to return to our historic practices and teachings, and then also want a Big Tent movement. Those don't go together. We can't expand the tent and recover our historic identity at the same time. Those are not the same goals. You can't return to what you were and then expand it. Those aren't the same thing. You're either making something new, or you're trying to return to what you were. And that's not the goal for many Methodists. And if that's the goal for a group that want to do something new or be more Big Tent, there are already groups like that exist. The Evangelical Covenant comes to mind. Maybe they're the Evangelical Brethren. I think many people in the GMC who want this Big Tent movement would probably be better served in the Evangelical Covenant if that's what they're looking for. And that's not a dig on anyone. That's just a practical point. I'm one of those people. If I want to be a Methodist, I want to be a Methodist. I don't want to be something else. So yes, I am very hopeful for the return of patristics just in general. So Yeah, most Methodists have no idea what patristics means. Most Western, not just most Western, most Christians today don't know what that means. Um, and I can say with confidence it's not just a Western issue, because plenty of Eastern Orthodox aren't that way, including in Eastern countries. And that can be for various reasons. All right, this isn't like a one size fits all. In America, for instance, we just have historical ignorance on a mass scale. Most people can't even tell you the past 100 years of history, um, let alone 2,000 years ago. But there have been lots of studies in Africa. The bottom section of my bookshelf over here has a whole section of textbooks on the history of Christianity in Africa. So that's where figures like Augustine come out of. Africa had a rich history of Christian tradition, and figures like Thomas Oden attributed most of Christianity's success to the foundations and work done in Africa. But many people forgot those. And a lot of people think Christianity didn't exist in Africa in any notable sense until the 1700s, 1800s, with the big missionary movements, and it brought this very what's the language they use? I'm trying to use language that won't get me even more demonetized on YouTube. A very American Christianity, shall we say, into Africa. And that's just not true. There was lots of rich, deep roots of Christianity in Africa. And we see that even in the New Testament, where there's the eunuch who is going through the Isaiah scroll in Acts 8, and then Philip evangelizes him, and then he goes back and takes it with him. It's already there. But we also see, right, I'm one of those people, Christianity predates the title Christian. It is the people of God, and that predates the title Christian, even though when Christ comes, clearly the meaning of people of God takes on a very specific meaning post the revelation of Christ. Oh, you have a call with Ken Collins. Can you tell us what that's about? Again, I haven't had a class with Collins. I've gone through his textbook, The Theology of John Wesley. That's sort of the standard textbook in our time on the theology of John Wesley. Yeah, if you haven't read a little of the Hymnody of Ephraim. Ephraim's very big. I thought it was Macarius of Egypt. Maybe it's pseudo Macarius of Egypt, had really big influence on John Wesley. If you go through the sermons of John Chrysostom, it's almost like you're hearing proto Wesley. I guess imitation's the biggest form of flattery, but if you go through the sermons of John Chrysostom, they are clearly influencing the way John Wesley preached. Now, I would say here, this is where one of those things we definitely want to be trying to lead with a bit of grace on. So I agree that big tents can breed heretics, but we also see plenty of historical examples that heretics pop up no matter what. Of course, I'm thinking of the Arians, but I just did go watch my presentation on Unitarianism. Go do it. One of the things I point out there is Unitarianism in its earlier forms, the Socinianism and some of the pre-Socinian movements. It comes out of Roman Catholicism. We have people popping up teaching those errors out of Lutherans, out of the Reformed, out of the Anglicans. So heretic, in one sense, can just be a spiritual class of people. It's people who are being influenced by the devil. And the devil is not picky where he works. He will work wherever he can. Now, if we want to have a conversation about what is more likely to breed heretics, that's a conversation that can be had. Being generic and ambiguous absolutely opens the door for that more than having clear and precise statements. But we also need to be enforcing those things. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how clear and precise you are. But we also have to recognize that doesn't guard us against these things either. Oh, okay. So if you guys you can share that publicly, awesome. Send me a link to it. If not, it is what it is. If my advice to Collins and to everyone involved in every discussion, well, that was weird. Behind doors in the Global Methodist is, I understand when you're having conversations that you then share with the public, you're opening the door for criticism that you're going to have to filter out. I think we need to do that. I think a big issue in the UMC was you'd get to conferences and things wouldn't be released until a few weeks or a few months before. Sometimes people wouldn't even know what was going to be discussed at the conference until they got there, just because they didn't have time to get to it, or for whatever reason. I think it would serve us well if the big things of conference, like the proposal of these articles, was released ahead of time, and then there was at least a year, hopefully 2 years, from between one conference and another, to publicly discuss it before you ever get to the conference, or at least have it open to a public discourse. I understand you're going to get voices you don't really want to hear. You're going to get people who are just negative Nancy's, and negative Nancy's, they suck, but they exist. It's part of it. But I think Methodism historically was better served when those conversations were public and things like the minutes. And at the very least, from a practical and prudential standpoint, we wouldn't have like what's happening right now with the articles, where there's all this pushback going on, and it's had this sort of blow up in a negative way because we don't know the context or anything going on, and there was no discussion ahead of time. Whereas if we could have had public discussion about it ahead of time, they probably wouldn't have come out as they are now, and maybe all of it would have been avoided. Maybe it wouldn't have been. We'll never know now. But that's my own thoughts. I think we need a lot more transparency and openness. And just because we're transparent and open on the conversations doesn't actually mean they have to listen to anyone. This is something I've wanted to tell. I have told my own bosses. Even if people aren't going to agree with your ultimate decision, at least if they understand the why, people are often a lot more willing to go along with things and to try and be kind and understanding when they at least understand what's going on, even if they don't agree with it. Yeah, there's definitely we do need to fight for our tradition, or there will be a lot of bad things. Yeah, this is a genuine concern, and you're not the only one I've seen make this statement. I've seen a lot of people have the same thing in response to the articles, and like, again, that's why I'm a fan of the public discussion. But I don't know if that would necessarily. I guess it would have stopped it because we know what the people are fighting for. And this is for me, working through the ordination process myself and going for it. It feels like there's this giant disconnect between the top level of the global Methodist structure and the bottom level. Like, I don't understand the motivation of our people at the highest ranks and on these conferences and on these committees, and why they're coming to the conclusions they are. Maybe they're talking about it somewhere and I'm just unaware of it. If so, when you make a post about these proposed articles, put a link in the proposed articles of, hey, here, go read our conversation in this place to see where we talked about it, or something. It feels like if this isn't reality, it feels this way. And it's because there's no discussion and no transparency here. It feels like the people up top want things to be run differently and to move in a different direction than many of the people below them. It feels like the Global Methodist Church has people on very different ends wanting to move forward and preserve Methodism, of having a common goal, but not having a common vision of how to do that and the best practical ways to be doing that as a body. And that's a problem. That's a conversation we need to have, and we can work out, but we actually have to have the conversation. I don't think that it's all just doom and gloom. I think there's a hope, and there's a future, and there's a brightness. I think God's still working, and we have plenty of people open to God working. So he will, whether or not we do it perfectly. But we certainly don't have to do it as imperfectly as we are. And I think if we just start having conversations that people haven't been wanting to have, even though it's going to be uncomfortable, and there will be a lot of growth pains in having those types of conversations. We'll have to figure things out. I'm certainly not used to having conversations like that. It would be a very big shift for me. But I think it's something we need to at least try. And I think the fruit of that would be worth it. And even if it doesn't bear fruit, we can at least say we tried it and it didn't work out. Yeah. This is also a very good thing. Like, some people have just said, "Why we could just keep the old ones," And I think that's a very good thing. If we don't think there's anything theologically wrong with the articles, and I know that the goal is to try and work out some of the supposed conflictions with the confession of faith. I would like to see the list of what they think are the conflictions. But if we think it's theologically sound, we don't have to change it. We could change the confession. We could do away with the confession. We could do something else. Why are we doing it this way? And Daniel Hickson commented on my post, and I'm one of those people. I'm a fan of even returning to the 39 articles. I'm a fan of expanding the 25 articles. We've had more conversations and more conflicts. The church has always clarified things in the face of controversy. This is how we've done things. We've had a lot of controversies since the time of the 25 articles. And if we're going to change the articles, I don't think change it as in removing or making more ambiguous. I think expanding, becoming more precise, and including controversies that have happened since then. I'm talking about the provisionists who are semi-Pelagians. We can talk about the being very clear on moral teachings. We could look again at the 39 articles, but yeah, this is true. And there are plenty of times where someone can be prideful and be unaware of it. And I'm probably number one on that, at least in my own little world. I also can be very good at hiding that pride from others because I'm not aware of it. So I just sort of like tuck it in. Sometimes it's very apparent to everyone but me. We should join GAFCON and be the Anglo Methodist. But pride can look different depending on where the pride's coming from. And it certainly feels like there's a fair amount of intellectual pride in certain areas of the Global Methodist where it's like, we've already settled this, the conversation's over. But not everyone agrees with that, Yeah. Now, and here's the thing is, I don't know if they have different ideas, but it feels like they have different ideas. But I won't know, and no one will know unless we start having conversations and get down to the root, and peel past all the layers. Like, yes, we have this common goal. We have this thing we're building together, but can we discuss the thing we're building in very particular, precise ways? Can we discuss the motivation for the articles? Can we discuss the motivation for what it is we want in a big tent? What does it mean to be a big tent? What are the limits of that tent? Can we have those conversations? The MANCA, the Methodist Anglican Communion of North America, MEJP and Nicaea 3. Part of Nicaea 3 has to be repealing Nicaea 2. Mandatory. I'm sure I have I have a video on anathemas. You can go hear my opinion on Nicaea 2 there. There we go. We got Genesis 5 and Methodist Reform. Someone messaged me on the side. It was a joke. It's funny. But yeah, does anyone else have any other questions that can be related to anything we've talked about or unrelated? I'm going to undo the stop button. We're entering casual mode now. Button undone, casual mode, engaged. But I think that's all I had. Well, it's more than I had. We went on some good, healthy discussion. Someone clip it and send it to all the people in all the places, And and if anyone does end up watching this after the fact and thinks I'm being too harsh on things, be precise, please. Tell me what you think I'm being too harsh on. I'm trying to do things in a way that leads with grace and love and charity as best I can. But also, you can't just be silent on issues. We actually need to call things out and try and have conversations on the things people don't want to talk about. But if you're so focused on being nice, then those conversations often won't happen. And there's a difference between niceness and kindness. It sounds odd to us in our modern ears, but John the Baptist and Jesus himself were being kind to the Pharisees when they called them a brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs and poisonous snakes, children of the devil. these types of things because they're trying to shake them awake to the reality that they're living in. It would not have been kindness to simply not say it like that. It would have been nice, but it wouldn't have been kind. And as Christians, we're called to be kind, not nice. Oh yeah, I've been discussing on valid priesthood with a Roman Catholic, i.e. sacrifice of the Mass. Yeah, one thing I've, and many do this, even though officially Rome is recognizing more and more Anglican orders, and I think officially they just recognize, maybe it's a specific branch of Anglicanism. I don't keep up with that part of the conversation. My engagements with Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, and I have a playlist on my channel, Protestant apologetics, and then some on very specific issues like the canon and stuff, are on not these types of issues because I kind of just don't care about their opinion on this matter. If they're wrong on these other more fundamental issues, their opinion on the validity of the ordination of people, it literally doesn't matter. But on the sacrifice of the Mass, so they've got two problems here. One, the Vatican II, which is an infallible ecumenical council, and whether or not it's promulgating ecumenical teaching as a new teaching, it claimed to be in complete continuity with all that came before it, infallibly. The Muslims adore the one true God. And that is the type of worship associated with true worship. It's not generic worship. It is true worship. So Muslims adore the one true God, but we Protestants don't. Okay, we've got a problem. And that extends as well to ordination. Second, are the angels not worshiping God? Like, they're not offering sacrifices up in heaven. The most you can say is some of them present incense that we get in Revelation 5, which is the prayers of the saints. But that's not a sacrifice. That's incense, and it's prayers. So are the angels not worshiping God? What do we do? Were the people of God, when the temple was destroyed and they had no temple to offer sacrifices, were they not worshiping God? What about people who were so separated from the temple they couldn't offer sacrifices? Were they not worshiping God? If you restrict it to the sacrifice of the Mass, then, and of course you have to talk about Old Testament because that informs New Testament and theology. It comes to some serious problems about what your doctrine of worship is, especially in light of statements like Jesus, where you will worship in spirit and truth. Like, worship is clearly more than simply sacrifice, and isn't even centralized around sacrifice in the sense they're wanting to push it on. It also kind of ignores the fact that historically Anglicans, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians have spoken of this Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, as a sacrifice. Now, it's not the same sacrifice Rome claims it is, but we've still spoken of it as a sacrifice. So we do have a sacrifice in the Eucharist. It's just not the type of sacrifice they want to talk it is. But I doubt many will know that, because a lot of us have sort of dropped that language of sacrifice around the Lord's Supper. I could go off on another rabbit trail. I'm not going to. Yeah, it seems to beg the question. And a lot of inter-tradition apologetics, in my experience, do that. And it's really kind of annoying, because a lot of them are conversations that have already been had, but people aren't wanting to go past that point. And you can't make anyone do that. It would be nice. But a lot of these are talking points that have been answered time and time and time and time again. But a lot of people are staying on the pop level, the popular level, the surface level of arguments, and not going deeper than that. But that's, we're nearing 8 o'clock. Does anyone have any other questions or such before I hop off here? If not, I hope my ramblings and mediocre presentation on Genesis 5 were entertaining and good. There was some good gems in there amidst my bumbling and fumbling. But I heard something. My Twitter handle. Let me go find it. Is it bad I don't know my own Twitter handle? It is at practical CL. So the word practical and then capital C, capital L. Because I guess Christian Lessons was too long or something at the time. So it's Joshua Pearsall, practical CL. Joshua Pearsall being the name. Boop, boop. If I can go. I'm wondering what tweet I have on there pinned currently. Oh, it was suddenly it was a tweet about Rome. Before that, I know I had a tweet pinned challenging Trent Horn to debate the death of Christ predicted in the Old Testament, because he said it wasn't. When he talked about Paul's statement in First Corinthians, I want to say, it was just that clearly, according to Trent, clearly that just means the death of Christ is in line with Old Testament teaching, but it wasn't the explicit teaching. I would just heavily challenge him. Actually, that's going to be part of my sermon this upcoming Sunday. I'm going to go off on this now because it got brought up. So I've talked about the Psalms as prophetic and messianic before on the channel. This is King James because that's what I picked up. Go watch my videos on the Psalms. I should just make a playlist on the Psalms on the channel if I haven't already. But I know there's a playlist of Jesus as Messiah and what is the real meaning of the Psalms, I think is the title of the video. But the Psalms, properly speaking, are Christocentric. They're about the coming Messiah. And that includes foretelling the death of the Messiah, right? Psalm 22 is about the crucifixion and death of the Messiah. Psalms 15 through 24 is a unit. And I have a video on Psalms 20 through 24. I need to cover all of them as one cohesive unit. But I do have a video on Psalms 20 through 24 that speak of the death and resurrection of the Messiah and suffering. And the Messiah being Jesus, that means it was talking about Jesus. Just because I know that, believe it or not, there are some people who would say because it didn't say Jesus or didn't say the Messiah, it wasn't talking about it. It's an actual argument people make. Anyway, so this is Acts 2, verse 29. So he's just, Peter, this is, of course, right after Pentecost. There's the outpouring of the spirits, which funnily starts in people's homes, not the temple. People have come out of their houses. They've now gathered. Peter's given this exhortation to the people. He said in verse 14, ye men of Judea and all ye that dwell in Jerusalem, be this known unto you and hearken unto my words. Listen up to what I'm about to tell you. And then he speaks of Christ being foretold, right? This is the plan of course, the prophecy of Joel, and then Christ being delivered up according to the definitive counsel and foreknowledge of God, the plan of God. He was crucified and slain. So notice that Peter explicitly says, by the foreknowledge of God and plan of God, Christ was crucified and slain. For David speaketh of him. This is verse 25. For David speaketh coming of him. I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is on my right hand, that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, also my flesh shall rest in hope, because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. And of course, as he goes on, he is very clear in verse, we'll go 30 to 31. Therefore, being a prophet, so Peter is calling David a prophet. There's no ambiguity. David's a prophet. And knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to his flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. He, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left, neither his flesh did see corruption. So by necessary consequence, to speak of the resurrection of Christ, he also had to know about the death of Christ, and he had talked about the death of Christ in the Psalms. That's just as an answer to Trent Horn's statement. But the implication of that, and this is something I'm going to talk about this Sunday. I don't think anyone that at the church I'll be preaching at will see this, so I don't have to worry about that. This means in David's Psalms, the book that became the hymn book of Israel, the prayer book of Israel, became part of the liturgical worship of Israel on a regular basis, enshrined the discussion of the Christ coming, death, and resurrection as part of its liturgical life as far back as David. Aspect of worship was this prophecy of the coming work of Christ that we celebrate every week, which includes his death. And boom, that was my mind when as I was studying that passage this week and was praying over it and noticed that. Maybe that's not a big deal to other people, but to me, that was a very big deal, seeing that there in the text of the Psalms. In the text of Acts with Peter, and then realizing, right, this has been part of the lifeblood of the people of God's worship for long before Christ was actually walking the earth and went to the cross to die. Man, just talking about it now. Hopefully it lands as hard on everyone else there as it is me, because that's just been circling around in my head the past few days. But yeah, I think that's it. I don't see anything else in the chat. So if anyone else has further questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. We're live most Thursdays, not every Thursday, but most Thursdays. I'm thinking about moving the stream up in time a little earlier in the day, and then I could, as long as I don't have something that comes up like last week when my car broke down, then we'll be able to do things on a pretty regular basis on Thursdays, at least through the summer. Because once the summer ends, my plans will be changing. I'll be getting involved with a church plant. I'll be sort of like an associate pastor. I don't know if I'll have an official title or not. We'll determine it when we get there, because I won't be getting paid for it. It'll all be for free, and that's fine with me. There's a reason I call the security work I do my tent making. And I guess speaking of that, if you guys want to support the ministerial work we're doing here, not just on the channel, but elsewhere, the only place financially currently to support is by going over to Substack and subscribing there at however much you would like to. There is a book in progress that will be coming out hopefully over this next year. This summer, I'm hoping to find the time to sit down, finally finish it, go through all the edits that me and the editor have talked about, and then send it off to the publisher, and then they'll handle it from there. So when that comes out, that will be away. But other than that, it's just Substack. Everything I do, it will continue to be for free. I don't intend to charge for anything I'm doing on any of these platforms. That's not my goal. It's not my hope. I want to be able to provide resources for the body of Christ, to help the body of Christ in ways that they can actually have. So I don't want to lock these things behind any paywalls. So if you want to support that, Substack's the way to do it right now. That's the only way right now, but in the future, there will be other ways. So you guys go in peace. Have a wonderful day. God bless.